Hello, I'm Darren Jordan. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your look at the world of business and economics. This week, corrupt and bankrupt. Powerful banking and political clans have destroyed Lebanon's economy. While people can't get access to their bank accounts, billions have been moved out of the country. President Trump wants to install his own man at the bank that will oversee Latin America's recovery from the pandemic, but some nations are opposed to the move. And the case of the gas power plant that wasn't built, but the company was awarded billions of dollars. Nigeria goes to court to reverse that decision. Lebanon is bankrupt. It's been brought to its knees by the powerful banking industry and its ties to the political elite. Sometimes those ties have been indistinguishable. Over 2 decades, money flowed from citizens to enrich bankers. And as the currency crisis unfolded, they extinguished any hopes of a recovery by blocking reforms and restricting access to money. Ordinary citizens can't get hold of their money and are limited to taking out just $200 every 2 weeks. And despite the controls in place to make sure money doesn't leave the country, $6 billion has been smuggled out. Astonishingly, it's estimated some $29.6 billion could seep out of the country this year. While the International Monetary Fund is in talks to offer a $10 billion bailout, economists believe the banking sector may need $96 billion to recapitalise. That would mean wiping out the shareholders of local oligarchs. Unsurprisingly, they're not interested in that and are holding up any agreement. Well, much of the blame has been put on the central bank, which is sitting on $40 billion of losses. The central bank's policy of maintaining a currency linked to the dollar convinced many that the country was a stable place to invest. As money was sucked in, the bank loaned it out to the government to pay for imports and interest on debts. It was good for the banks who bought up the debt. The interest on those loans helped them to pay $22 billion in dividends to shareholders. By 2019, half of the government's fiscal revenues went to pay the interest on debts. So you can see the conflict of interest. Why would you, as a politician and bank shareholder, oppose increased government spending? Well, let's bring in some expert analysis. Joining me now from Beirut via Skype is Mohamed Haj Ali. Mohamed is a research fellow at the Beirut-based Carnegie Middle East Centre. Mohamed, so how did the conflict of interest between the banks and the politicians first unfold? How did it start?
It unfolded during the 1990s after the Taif Agreement and the consociational system in which you had different sects, leaders sharing power. After that, we had a banking sector which was divided along the same fault line, along the same confessional lines. And so the business leaders and also the politicians became partners, and as the government started taking more and more loans to fund the reconstruction of the country, based on the premise that, when Lebanon signs an agreement, a peace agreement with Israel, the international community would wipe off our debt and pay it off by a hefty sum, and that by being very well positioned with a good infrastructure, that the country could actually face the increased competition brought in by a peace agreement with Israel. That was the premise under which these massive reconstruction projects were undertaken. But also we've seen an increase. Yes?
So where was the regulator in all of this? What was the central bank doing whilst all this was going on?
It was entangled with the banking sector. I mean, the regulator is not really a regulator. It's a partner of the banking sector. I mean, now we're seeing the extent of the dealings between the central bank governor, Riyad Salemi, who was since the 1990s the leading financial regulator, and the Lebanese banks. We've seen them in the what we call in Lebanon Handasat al-Maliya, which is the financial swaps, the swaps that happened between the banks and the central bank, in which they made billions of dollars of profit in a split second. and how some of that money was being transferred one way or the other and abroad. I mean, we just saw an investigative piece which shows the extent of the dealings between, for instance, one bank, Bank Audi, and the central bank's governor. So they were in bed, just specifically as much as the politicians were in bed with the banking sector, having people in each board of directors, etc. The same thing was happening between the central bank governor and the banks. There were dealings. He was the protector of the banking sector.
And some people, analysts, economists, have even accused the central bank of running a Ponzi scheme. Briefly, what's your take on that?
I think the banking sector turned into a massive marketing machine. I mean, it employed thousands of people. You can see them looking like salespeople, like a PR network, which extended to the Lebanese diaspora, Africa, Central America, etc. Reaching out to any Lebanese expat abroad and asking them to bring their money in. I mean, you would be surprised to learn what kind of, to what extent they went to get some of that money. They had representatives across the world. They were meeting Lebanese expats, offering them all kinds of interest packages, and attracting all of that money to give it directly to the Lebanese government to spend it recklessly without any plan of how that money would be paid. Yes, it is a Ponzi scheme. It has all the signs of one, and it is one.
So, Mohammed, in terms of outside help, are we inching then towards a bailout from the IMF? And what seems to be the holdup?
Yes, I mean, now the political class will undergo some serious reforms, and it will go to the IMF. But the package will in no way reach the numbers that the Lebanese political class would need to help the banking sector go back to its previous order. This is not possible anymore, and many are now pointing out that some sort of a haircut is needed, whether it's a direct haircut or it's an indirect one, like the one we're witnessing now, in which you can't really take your deposits. You would take them in Lebanese pounds at a discounted price, given the inflation and given the appreciation of the Lebanese pounds. So this is now the status quo. Depositors will lose much of their money, and Lebanon will get a small package from the IMF. The old order, in which high government spending was used for political reasons, will no longer be. This is the reality of things.
Let's quickly talk about one other route, because Lebanon has gold reserves estimated to be in excess of something like $16 billion. Could that perhaps provide a financial lifeline?
I doubt it would provide a financial lifeline, given that Lebanon's external debt is nearly $30 billion. And, if this is a lifeline, it would be used either to pay some of that external debt, or to be brought here to also be paid for depositors as depositors' money. And I think, all of the routes have been discussed by this political class, and there's only one: seeking external help and also doing a haircut and changing the economic system internally. Everyone now is talking about more productivity, shifting away from high government spending, etc. So all of these options are on the table. They just need to do them. And I think this is an existential crisis for the current political order.
Mohammed, let me get a final thought from you. In terms of the body politic, are there hopes perhaps that a new political class can step forward, step up to the plate and run the country?
This will be a really slow process, given how the confessional system works, given the regional competition. There's also some external help and funding provided to the political class, whether from Iran or whether from the Gulf region, etc. I think this will be a slow process, but it will happen, given that we've shifted from an economic order which allows these politicians to sustain themselves for many years into a new economic order, which will see a different private sector. That will have its own implications on the political class.
Mohamed Haj Ali, thank you very much for your thoughts here on counting the cost. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Now, the battle to decide who will control the Washington-based Inter-American Development Bank has split Latin America and become a bitter issue. The reason is the White House's decision to field an American candidate to run Latin America's principal development bank. Lucia Newman explains from Santiago.
It's called the IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, a kind of distant cousin of the IMF. When it was founded in 1959, former U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower promised it would always be led by a Latin American. And it always has. But now, just as Latin America is projected to suffer the worst economic impact from the pandemic of any region in the world, the White House is fielding a candidate to lead the region's most important development institution. And the battle is on.
It is a surprise. It breaks a tradition, an unwritten rule. So this is what caused this reaction in Latin America. And we in Chile, former finance and foreign ministers, signed a letter, very respectfully, I must say this, very respectfully saying that we are asking for the election to be postponed, to have a time to discuss.
Larraín, a possible candidate himself, is not alone. President Donald Trump has picked hardline advisor Mauricio Claver-Carone as his choice to control the IDB. One reason for the sudden interest, according to U.S. government sources, is to counter growing Chinese influence in Latin America. Countries like Argentina, Mexico, and Chile argue that there are far more qualified professionals in the region than Claver-Carone, who's not an economist but a lawyer with a political agenda. A long list of former and current Latin American leaders are in fact demanding the election be postponed until after the U.S. election. But many countries are under pressure from Washington.
So the fact that the U.S. should try to impose their candidate on the rest of the hemisphere does not seem to me to be a good precedent.
Well, do you think that the person that they are trying to impose, to quote you, is unqualified?
I don't think he's unqualified, but if he were a citizen of Belize, I am somehow inclined to think he would not be a strong candidate to lead the IDB.
For decades, the bank has played a key role in a region that has little access to international capital markets. It finances infrastructure and social development projects, which will now be more vital than ever. The U.S. candidate argues the United States wants to play a bigger role in the region and that it's time to break with tradition and modernize the IDB.
If the way of modernizing the IDB is to run the IDB like the United States government is being run today, where a highly advanced, wealthy country is experiencing some of the highest rates of contagion in the world, I hope that's not the future fate of the IDB.
Backroom negotiations are intensifying. Until now, the bank has been led by a Latin American who elicits broad consensus amongst peers, earning the IDB widespread respect. This time round, the U.S. candidate may indeed win, but if so, that broad consensus will be shattered. Lucia Newman, Al Jazeera, Santiago.
Now, imagine being awarded $6.6 billion for not sticking a spade in the ground. Well, on the receiving end of that ruling back in 2017 was Nigeria. That award to a British Virgin Island registered company has ballooned to almost $10 billion when you add in all the interest. Well, Nigeria's President Muhammadu Buhari accused the company of attempting to cheat Nigeria out of billions of dollars. Back in 2010, two Irish businessmen agreed to set up a gas power plant, but Nigeria never built the pipeline to the plant. Well, the company, Process and Industrial Development, has denied any wrongdoing, and Nigeria is challenging the award in the British High Court right now. The case has drawn a great deal of interest from advocacy groups that claim investors can extract billions even from failed investments. So let's talk to Kawar Qureshi, QC, head of McNair Chambers. He joins us via Skype from London. Kawar, so why did this award go against Nigeria? I mean, it seems unfair, given that the Irish company didn't even put a spade in the ground, but they claim to have spent $40 million just on design.
So far as this particular case is concerned, from what I can glean, there are public documents, including a judgment of the High Court. The claimant's position is very simply this: a contract was entered into in 2010, as you've just summarized. It was breached by Nigeria in 2012. There was a protracted arbitration process which led to a finding of liability against Nigeria, that they breached the contract. And then subsequently, it's being suggested that Nigeria didn't do enough to contest the next phase, which is the damages phase, leading to that substantial award that you've just mentioned. And I ought to add that in my 30 years of experience in practice as a barrister, I've acted for or against nearly 60 states on commercial arbitration matters. And such sums are not unusual. They're substantial, but I'm afraid awards against states of hundreds of millions of dollars are not uncommon.
Under the circumstances, Kawar, could the court set aside the award or even overturn it?
Arbitration is a process that's been agreed to very often by states in commercial contracts. And the assumption, quite often the wrong assumption, is that the state has undertaken effective due diligence, legal review, and due diligence, commercial due diligence of the counterparty. That seems not to be often the case. However, when it comes to the award of the arbitrators, the perceived virtue of arbitration is that it's not like a court process. Arbitral awards, thanks to a convention of 1958, are subject to very limited grounds of challenge when they're taken to states for enforcement. And the ground that I understand that Nigeria is invoking before the English courts is known as public policy. They're suggesting that the contract was tainted by fraud and corruption. To establish that, they would need fairly strong evidence for the English court to conclude that that was in fact the case. If they were able to establish that, then the English court would not countenance enforcement.
And could the company seek to perhaps seize assets in the United States? How would that work, for instance?
Ordinarily, once an arbitral award has been issued, there is a limited period of time for that award to be challenged. In this case, Nigeria sought to challenge out of time and sought to deploy evidence that they contended wasn't available during the arbitral process. However, there's nothing to stop the beneficiary of an arbitral award, the claimant, from seeking to enforce the award wherever Nigeria has commercial assets. So they could go against the physical assets, property owned by the state of Nigeria, proceeds of sale of oil, ships, aircraft, anything that they could lay their hands on which isn't encumbered. Theoretically, of course, that could include assets in the United States of America and indeed anywhere else.
So, Kawar, let me ask you, why do investors choose arbitration in London or New York? And is that fair to developing nations?
Ultimately, as I mentioned to you at the outset, it's open to a state to try and negotiate a contract with the foreign investor. And there are some states, because of their bargaining power, maybe because of their level of sophistication, that insist that if there's going to be a dispute, it must be before the local courts. But generally, commercial investors take the view, rightly or wrongly, that the local courts are unlikely to find against the state or an emanation of the state, that the process before the local courts may be lengthy, uncertain. Arbitration has the virtue of providing an award that's enforceable with very limited options available to the defendant. And London, New York have both been chosen because historically they've been seen as having not just stable, strong financial centers, but a good legal pool. It's easy to come and go from there. And the courts, certainly in England, have for decades signaled their support for the arbitration process as opposed to adopting a position of intervention, which unfortunately is seen to be the case in some jurisdictions, which are therefore unlikely to attract arbitration.
And Kawar, there's a growing trend in trade negotiations for nations to agree to pay the full value of a contract to corporations if a deal goes sour. Is that a fair practice, do you think?
Ultimately, it's for the state to determine what it is prepared to agree to. And the optimum position for a state is to take proper advice, commercial advice, legal advice, and once they've taken that advice, to form a view as to whether the contract is sustainable. The foreign investors' position, having acted for lots of foreign investors, having acted for states, the foreign investor's position is understandable. I've been invited in. I have spent money, however much it may be. I have a commercial expectation, a legitimate expectation that the state's undermined. And therefore, I'm entitled to pursue a claim to finality and seek an award. I have to say, though, that in addition to arbitration, there is a framework which provides protection to investors through what are known as bilateral investment treaties, state to state. And some states have now started to denounce those treaties, particularly in South America, as well as renegotiate them, because they're taking the view that these are one-sided.
Kawar, just a final brief thought to you. I mean, people will look at other cases which have been dragged through the courts, for example, vulture funds in Argentina. There is a perception that investors aren't willing to take big losses, and there's always a get-out clause that sees them walking off with huge payments.
Even if there were such a perception, and even if it was well-founded, I come back to the main point that I raised at the outset. Investors are entering into jurisdictions or entering into contracts, and it's incumbent upon states to ensure that their interests are properly protected. So they take proper legal advice, they undertake due diligence. Often that doesn't happen. And the reasons why we can speculate, but if there's a problem, that may well be one of the major areas that states need to address.
Kawar Qureshi, great to get your thoughts. Thank you very much indeed for talking to Counting the Cost. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, Argentina is ramping up the defence of its maritime territory to prevent illegal fishing by foreign boats. Countries across Latin America are concerned about Chinese ships entering their waters and depleting stocks. Teresa Bow reports from Buenos Aires.
Argentina's Coast Guards escort a Chinese fishing ship towards a port in Patagonia. It's an operation by air and sea to control attempts by foreign vessels to fish illegally in Argentine waters.
1 shine 801, stop and shine, sir, stop and shine.
International ships are allowed to fish outside the economic exclusive zone. But in recent years, there's been a sharp increase in attempts to cross what is known as the Mile 200, where Argentine waters begin.
Our sea platform is one of the richest in the world. So far this year, we have captured 2 ships already. We have a protocol, so the captain can act according to international law.
Using radars and other types of communication, Argentina can track ships violating its exclusive zone.
This type of vessels are the ones that are used to patrol Argentina's exclusive zone. If a ship is found to be fishing illegally in those waters, then that ship can be captured and the owners have to pay a fine. This vessel, for example, has been involved in several operations, and it has the ships that it has captured in the past. It has the name, the date, and the country it belonged to. Most of them belong to China and then Spain.
Even though there are many companies from different countries involved in illegal fishing, China has become a main concern. With an overseas fleet of over 16,000 ships, they pose a major threat to developing countries. Just recently, around 300 ships were located outside the Galapagos Island. Such fishing is not illegal because it takes place in international waters, but it can cause damage in one of the richest and biodiverse regions in the world.
In terms of the global governance structure, the international bodies, I mean, they can do a lot to put pressure on countries like China.
But most nations do not want a conflict with China, leaving developing countries to defend their resources in whatever way they can. Teresa Bow, Al Jazeera, Buenos Aires.
And that is our show for this week. But remember, you can get in touch with us via Twitter. Use the hashtag AJCTC when you do. Or you can drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. But there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Darren Jordan from the whole team here. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.